There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry with them without knowing it came from a press release. It arrived through official briefings delivered in air-conditioned rooms in Saigon, through numbers that were never meant to reflect reality and were never seriously challenged by the people who received them, and through a sustained institutional effort to present a conflict that was visibly deteriorating as one that was quietly being won. The misunderstanding theory, the idea that Vietnam was simply a war that Americans failed to grasp, that it was too complex, too foreign, too asymmetrical for conventional military thinking to absorb, that theory is itself a kind of cover story. Because the people running the war understood it well enough. They understood that the metrics they were using were broken. They understood that the reporting chains were compromised from the bottom up. They understood that what was being described in classified cables bore almost no resemblance to what was being said at press conferences. And they continued anyway, not out of confusion, out of institutional momentum, career protection, political calculation, and a particular kind of bureaucratic cowardice that does not announce itself as cowardice, but presents itself as professionalism. What happened in Vietnam over the course of roughly 2 decades of direct American involvement was not a failure of understanding, it was a failure of honesty, repeated so many times and at so many levels that it eventually became the structure of the war itself. The lies were not incidental, they were load-bearing. Remove them, and the entire justification for continued American presence collapses, which is precisely why they were maintained, extended, elaborated, and in some cases made official policy. The soldiers who fought in that war did not, for the most part, participate in the lying consciously. They were sent into a situation that had been constructed through deception, handed objectives that had been defined through deception, and then asked to report results using metrics that were themselves instruments of deception. And when they came back, many of them found that the things they had witnessed, the things they knew to be true about what had happened over there, were not things the institutions they served wanted recorded. This is not a story about individual atrocities, though individual atrocities appear in it. It is a story about how a military and political system generates and sustains falsehood under pressure, how that falsehood spreads downward through command structures until it reaches the men carrying rifles in triple canopy jungle, and what happens to those men when they are asked to inhabit a reality that does not match what is directly in front of them. It is a story about the specific and particular things that were ordered to be kept quiet, and about why silence in that context was not neutral. Silence was the mechanism by which the war continued. The body count was the first and most consequential lie to become institutional. In a war without front lines, without territory that could be seized and held in any conventional sense, without clear markers of advance or retreat, the Pentagon needed a metric. Robert McNamara and the systems analysts he brought into the Defense Department were men who believed that any problem could be quantified, tracked, and managed if you collected the right data. The body count was their answer to the fundamental question of progress in a counterinsurgency. If you could not measure ground gained, you could measure enemy dead. If the ratio of enemy killed to American killed was favorable enough, and if it was sustained long enough, the enemy's will and capacity to fight would eventually be exhausted. This was the theory. It was called attrition. It assumed that the enemy was a fixed resource that could be depleted. It assumed that the enemy's behavior would follow the rational calculations of a conventional military force. Both assumptions were wrong, and people in positions to know they were wrong knew it early. What the body count actually measured was pressure. It measured the pressure on platoon commanders to produce numbers. It measured the pressure on company commanders to aggregate those numbers upward in a form that would satisfy battalion. It measured the pressure on battalion to report to brigade in a way that demonstrated progress. And at each level of that chain, the pressure to produce favorable numbers was greater than the pressure to produce accurate ones, because accurate numbers in many cases would have demonstrated that the strategy was not working, which was not something the chain of command wanted to hear, and was not something that careers were built on conveying. So the numbers moved, not dramatically, not in ways that would have been immediately obvious to anyone looking at a single report. They moved incrementally, plausibly, in the way that numbers move when many people at many levels are each adding a small adjustment in the same direction for the same reason. The rules about what counted as a confirmed kill were loose enough to accommodate almost anything. In the early years, there was at least a nominal requirement that a body be present, that there be some physical evidence of a death. But in practice, in the field, this requirement dissolved almost immediately. A blood trail counted. Shell craters in a tree line counted. The word of the point man counted. And in many units, by the middle years of the war, the rule became simpler still. If you were in a free fire zone and you fired your weapon, you had probably killed someone, and that someone was probably the enemy. The designation of free fire zones itself deserves attention here. A free fire zone, which was officially called a specified strike zone in Pentagon terminology, was an area from which civilians had theoretically been relocated, in which anything that moved could be considered hostile and engaged without further authorization. The theory required that the relocations actually happen, that the people living in those areas actually leave, and that the areas be clear of non-combatants before the designation was applied. In practice, the relocations were often incomplete, sometimes coerced, occasionally fictional. People stayed. People returned. People who had lived in a place for generations did not simply leave because a South Vietnamese government official posted a notice. And so, the free fire zones were often not free of civilians, and the kills that were accumulated in them were not always, or even primarily, combatants. There is a specific arithmetic problem embedded in the body count that was identified early and documented in internal reports and never seriously addressed, because addressing it would have required admitting that the metric itself was broken. The problem was this: the estimated size of enemy forces in South Vietnam at the beginning of significant American involvement was somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 fighters. Over the course of the war, the United States and its allies reported killing enemy combatants at rates that, if accumulated and projected, would have exterminated that force several times over. The enemy kept fighting. The enemy kept recruiting. The enemy absorbed losses that should, by the logic of the attrition strategy, have been catastrophic, and continued to function, continued to mount major operations, continued to control significant portions of the countryside. The explanation that was sometimes offered internally was that the initial estimates of enemy strength were too low. This was true. There were people in the intelligence community, most notably Samuel Adams at the CIA, who argued persistently and with documentary support that the official enemy order of battle was being artificially suppressed, that it did not include self-defense militia and political cadres who were absolutely part of the enemy's operational capacity. The debate over this came to a head in 1967. When the Military Assistance Command Vietnam and the CIA produced competing assessments of enemy strength, and the military's lower number prevailed for reasons that had more to do with what General Westmoreland could say publicly than with what the evidence actually showed. If the true enemy strength were acknowledged, the progress that had been claimed based on body counts would have looked like what it was, which was no progress at all. So the number was suppressed. And the war continued on the basis of a fabricated optimism. The Tet Offensive in January of 1968 was, in military terms, a defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that launched it. They took enormous casualties. They failed to hold any of the urban centers they attacked. The popular uprising they expected to trigger among the South Vietnamese population did not happen. By the metrics the military had been using, Tet should have been a confirmation of progress. Instead, it destroyed public confidence in the war because the American public, watching Viet Cong fighters breach the walls of the American embassy in Saigon, watching the ancient imperial city of Hue fall and then be recaptured at enormous cost, watching the footage of street fighting in cities that were supposed to be secure, understood something that the official briefings had not prepared them for. The country that had been described as on the verge of stabilization was not stable. The enemy that had been described as nearly broken was not broken. The gap between the official version and the visible reality was suddenly too large to paper over with statistics. But what is important to understand is that the gap had not appeared at Tet. The gap had been there from almost the beginning. Tet did not create the crisis. It revealed a crisis that had been systematically concealed. The concealment was not only institutional, it was personal, individual, granular, distributed across hundreds of thousands of individual decisions made by individual soldiers and officers who had reasons, some of them understandable, some of them careerist, some of them simply practical, to not report what they had seen. A junior officer who witnessed his men engage a group of farmers and file a report describing the dead as enemy combatants had a choice. He could correct the report. He could note that the dead were unarmed, that there were no weapons recovered, that the area was not a confirmed enemy operating zone. He could write what he actually saw, and if he did that, he would be writing a document that contradicted his commanding officer's report, that raised questions about the unit's conduct, that initiated a process he could not control, and that would follow him through his career. Or he could say nothing. Not agree, not sign off enthusiastically, just say nothing, let the report stand, move on to the next day. The war generated that choice, in some form, thousands of times. The answer, most of the time, was silence. Among the things that were most consistently kept quiet was the nature and extent of civilian casualties. The official position throughout the war was that the United States military took extraordinary precautions to avoid civilian harm, that civilian casualties were regrettable but rare, that they occurred as a result of enemy actions or unavoidable military necessity, and that they were investigated and addressed when they came to light. None of this was true in any serious sense. Civilian casualties were not rare. They were endemic to the way the war was fought. The strategic Hamlet program, the free fire zones, the use of air power against populated areas, the defoliation campaigns, the search and destroy operations, all of these generated civilian casualties at rates that were known at various levels of the command structure, and were not reported accurately because accurate reporting would have been an indictment of the strategy itself. The estimates of civilian deaths in Vietnam during the American war period vary enormously depending on the source and the methodology, but credible demographic analyses suggest numbers in the hundreds of thousands for South Vietnamese civilians killed by American and Allied firepower, and those numbers were not present in any official accounting. The Phoenix program is one of the more documented examples of the gap between official description and operational reality. Phoenix was a joint CIA and South Vietnamese intelligence effort designed to identify and neutralize, which was the official term, members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. The infrastructure meant the political and administrative apparatus that the Viet Cong maintained in the villages, the tax collectors, the recruiters, the local officials, the sympathizers who provided intelligence and support. The theory was sound enough, as counterinsurgency theory went. If you could dismantle the political network, the military network would wither. The operation, which ran from roughly 1968 to 1972, reported impressive numbers. Tens of thousands of Viet Cong infrastructure members neutralized. But neutralized covered a range of outcomes. It meant captured, it meant defected under the Chio Hoi amnesty program, and it meant killed. And the killed category was the one that generated the most pressure and the most distortion. Province quotas were established for the number of Viet Cong infrastructure members to be neutralized each month. When the quotas were not met through captures or defections, they were sometimes met through killings. When killings were needed to meet quotas, the definition of who constituted a member of the Viet Cong infrastructure became flexible. People with personal enemies, people who owed money, people who were in the wrong place. People who were denounced by informants who had their own reasons for making accusations. The program produced genuine intelligence results in some areas and genuine disruption of Viet Cong networks. It also produced a documented pattern of extrajudicial killing, torture, and the murder of people who were not what they were officially described as, and the official reports did not reflect this. The numbers went up. The program was declared a success. The people who ran it at the operational level knew what was in the numbers and what was not. There is a category of Vietnam War experience that sits between official policy and individual atrocity that is described by historians as the routine violence of counterinsurgency, and that was almost entirely absent from any official accounting during the war. It consisted of things that were not ordered, not forbidden, not reported, and not remembered officially. The burning of villages, not the dramatic, photographed, notorious incidents, but the ordinary ones. The villages burned after contact with an ambush. The hooches torched during a sweep because someone thought they smelled recent occupation. The livestock killed. The food stores destroyed. The acts of casual destruction that were standard practice in areas where the distinction between the population and the enemy had become meaningless in operational terms. The logic was a version of the same logic that animated the free fire zones. If the population was supporting the enemy, and the enemy was indistinguishable from the population, then the population was part of the problem, and eliminating the population's capacity to support the enemy was a legitimate military objective. This logic was never officially articulated in those terms because articulating it in those terms would have been a war crimes statement. But it was operationally present. It shaped behavior at the unit level in ways that were understood by command structures and not corrected because correcting them would have required acknowledging them. The drug situation in Vietnam was another thing that was known and not spoken about in any honest official way. By the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, drug use among American troops had reached levels that were operationally significant, meaning that it was affecting unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in measurable ways. Heroin was available in South Vietnam at prices and purities that were astonishing by American standards, and a substantial number of American soldiers used it. The estimates vary, but internal military surveys, the ones that were not written for public release, put the percentage of soldiers who had used heroin in Vietnam at figures that ranged from 10 to 15% of enlisted men in some periods, and some units, with higher figures in rear echelon support positions, where the boredom and the absence of the adrenaline that combat provided left men with more time and more reason to seek chemical escape. The official response was to treat drug use as a disciplinary and moral failing, to discharge users under less than honorable conditions, to pursue dealers in ways that were sometimes genuine and sometimes performative. The unofficial response was to understand that the drug problem was a symptom of a morale problem, and that the morale problem was a symptom of a war problem, and that none of those problems could be solved by the means available, so they were managed, minimized in official reporting, and largely kept out of the narrative that was being constructed for domestic consumption. The fragging problem was even more carefully managed in official communications. Fragging, the deliberate killing or wounding of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own men, became a documented phenomenon in the Vietnam War at levels that had no parallel in American military history. The term came from the fragmentation grenades that were the weapon most commonly used, because fragmentation grenades left no ballistic evidence, because the explosion in a combat environment could be attributed to enemy action, because the grenade rolled under a cot in the dark leaves nothing to trace. The Pentagon tracked fragging incidents through the Criminal Investigation Division, and the numbers in the official reports, which themselves were not public, showed a steady increase through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s. There were hundreds of documented incidents. There were suspected incidents that could not be confirmed. The actual number was almost certainly higher than any official figure because the incentive structure around reporting a fragging ran exactly counter to honesty. A unit that reported a fragging had admitted to a breakdown in discipline, command authority, and cohesion that reflected badly on every level of its command chain. The pressure not to report was substantial. When a soldier died in a combat environment under ambiguous circumstances, the ambiguity was often resolved in the direction of enemy action. The fragging problem became visible enough by 1971 that it was discussed in congressional testimony and covered in the press. But the scale of it, the degree to which it represented a systemic breakdown rather than isolated incidents, was something that official sources consistently minimized. The relationship between American forces and the South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was another area in which official representation and operational reality were almost entirely disconnected. The official story required that the ARVN be a capable, improving force that was being developed through American training and support into a military that could eventually defend South Vietnam on its own. Vietnamization, the Nixon administration's policy from 1969 onward, was premised entirely on this story. The plan was to transfer responsibility for the ground war to the ARVN while withdrawing American troops, and the political viability of the plan required that the ARVN be described as improving even when the evidence was otherwise. American advisors embedded with ARVN units sent reports through their own channels that described unit performance in terms that ranged from mixed to deeply troubling. Desertions were high. Leadership at the junior officer level was inconsistent at best. The corruption that permeated the South Vietnamese government extended into the military supply chain, so that weapons, ammunition, and equipment intended for frontline units were sometimes diverted, sometimes sold, sometimes simply accounted for on paper that did not reflect physical reality. Some ARVN units fought with genuine courage and effectiveness. Others did not. The official narrative required that the overall trajectory be described as positive, which meant that negative assessments were softened, context was added, improvements were emphasized, and the structural problems that advisors were documenting were absorbed into a reporting framework that produced optimism from raw material that did not support it. The Cambodian incursion of 1970 was presented to the American public as a limited, targeted operation to destroy enemy sanctuaries, a temporary measure that would shorten the war by eliminating the base areas from which North Vietnamese forces were staging attacks into South Vietnam. The operation was presented as confined in both time and geography. What it actually accomplished was the destabilization of a neutral country that had been maintaining a precarious balance, the expansion of the war into territory that American forces were not authorized to enter under existing rules of engagement, and the acceleration of processes that would eventually bring the Khmer Rouge to power and produce one of the 20th century's most complete humanitarian catastrophes. The Nixon administration knew before the operation began that the Cambodian government of Lon Nol, which had recently deposed the neutralist Prince Sihanouk, was fragile, and that American military action on Cambodian soil would complicate the political situation in ways that could not be easily managed. This was assessed internally, and the assessment did not change the decision. The operation went forward. The sanctuaries were disrupted but not destroyed, because the enemy had the capacity to move and disperse in response to military pressure. American forces withdrew. The border areas remained contested. The broader Cambodian crisis continued to develop along the lines that had been internally assessed as likely, and the official accounting of what the incursion had achieved did not reflect what the internal assessments had projected. The secret bombing of Cambodia, Operation Menu, which preceded the incursion and ran from 1969 into 1970, was perhaps the most extreme example of institutionalized concealment in the entire war. B-52 strikes were conducted against Cambodian territory, against a country with which the United States was not at war, in operations that were classified at such a level that the crews flying the missions filed false flight plans showing their targets as within South Vietnam. The falsification of military records was the operational method. It was not a side effect or an inadvertent consequence. The records had to be false because the operations were not legally authorized, because Cambodia's neutrality was a political reality that the administration was unwilling to formally violate while actually violating it, and because congressional oversight of military operations depended on accurate records that these operations were specifically designed to circumvent. The people who filed the false records knew they were false. The people who received them and processed them had, in most cases, enough information to understand what they were actually looking at. The system functioned because everyone within it had reasons to accept the official version and costs associated with challenging it. When the bombing was eventually revealed to the public, the administration's position was that it had been necessary, that it had been effective, that the concealment had been required by operational security. None of these claims survived serious scrutiny, but the scrutiny came years later, after the operations were complete, after the records had been what they were for years, after the patterns of deception had been established as normal. The treatment of prisoners of war, both American prisoners held by North Vietnam and prisoners of various descriptions held by American and South Vietnamese forces, was another area in which the official version diverged from documented reality in both directions. The treatment of American prisoners by North Vietnamese captors was brutal, involving extended isolation, physical abuse, and torture, designed to produce military and political information and to generate propaganda. This was known and documented and eventually became one of the major emotional reference points of American Vietnam War memory. What was less publicly acknowledged was the treatment of prisoners held by American and Allied forces, and particularly the treatment of prisoners processed through the South Vietnamese interrogation system. The CIA's involvement in prisoner interrogation, the use of techniques that would in later decades be classified as torture in international legal frameworks, the existence of interrogation centers at provincial level throughout South Vietnam, where people who had been designated as Viet Cong or Viet Cong suspects were subjected to methods that included water torture, electrical shock, and extended physical abuse. These things were documented in internal reports, were known to American advisors and intelligence officers at various levels, and were not reflected in official characterizations of how the war was being conducted. The official position was that the United States did not conduct or facilitate torture. The operational reality was that American personnel were present at, advised, and in some cases participated in interrogations that bore no relationship to that position. The environmental legacy of the war, particularly the Agent Orange and herbicide defoliation program, represents a category of concealment that extended beyond the war itself and continued for decades afterward. The defoliation program, conducted primarily through Operation Ranch Hand, used herbicides including Agent Orange to destroy vegetation that provided cover for enemy movement and to destroy food crops in areas considered to be enemy-controlled. The scale of the operation was enormous. Millions of acres were sprayed over the course of the program. The chemicals used, particularly the dioxin contaminant in Agent Orange, were known by some people within the program to be potentially dangerous to human health. The evidence for this was not conclusive at the time the program was at its height, but it was present, and the decision was made to continue the program while the health questions were unresolved, which meant that the questions were effectively decided in favor of continuation by default. American military personnel were exposed to these chemicals. Vietnamese civilians were exposed at far higher concentrations and for longer periods. The health consequences, which included cancers, birth defects, and neurological disorders, emerged over years and decades after the war ended. The Department of Defense and the chemical companies that produced the herbicides spent years in legal and administrative proceedings disputing the connection between chemical exposure and health outcomes, using resources and legal strategies that were not available to the individuals claiming damage. The Veterans Administration's recognition of Agent Orange-related conditions was slow, contested, and incomplete for years after the epidemiological evidence had become quite strong. The concealment in this case was not a single decision, but a sustained institutional posture of skepticism toward evidence that pointed toward liability. The American division and the events surrounding My Lai represent one of the clearest documented cases of how the reporting system was designed to absorb atrocities rather than reveal them. The massacre at My Lai village on March 16, 1968, in which soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry killed somewhere between 300 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mostly women, elderly men and children, was not a secret to the people who participated in it, to the people who observed it from helicopters above, or to the unit's command structure. It was reported up the chain immediately by Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot who landed his aircraft between the soldiers and the fleeing civilians and threatened to open fire on his own countrymen to stop the killing. Thompson's report went into the system and produced no investigation, no action, no accountability. The official reports of the operation described a successful engagement with enemy forces, with enemy casualties in the dozens. The true nature of what had happened was buried under routine paperwork for months. It was eventually exposed not by the military's own accountability mechanisms, but by a journalist, Seymour Hersh, acting on a tip from a soldier named Ron Riddenauer, who had not been at My Lai himself, but had heard accounts from men who were, and who had spent months trying to get the military and Congress to investigate before going to the press. The system did not expose My Lai. The system concealed it, and continued to conceal it for over a year after it happened, and would have continued to conceal it indefinitely if external pressure had not forced a response. What My Lai revealed about the broader system was not the existence of a single unit that had committed a single atrocity. What it revealed was a command structure that had been producing the conditions for atrocities systematically and then absorbing the evidence of them routinely. The American Division's operational area, Quang Ngai Province, had been a heavily contested region in which the distinction between civilian and combatant had effectively dissolved for operational purposes. Villages in the area had been subjected to years of bombardment, forced relocation, and military sweep operations. The civilian population that remained was viewed with deep suspicion by American forces because it was, in many cases, genuinely providing support to Viet Cong forces operating in the area, partly by choice and partly because the consequences of not cooperating with the Viet Cong were severe. The soldiers of Charlie Company who entered My Lai on the morning of March 16th had been told they were going to engage a Viet Cong battalion. They had been primed by weeks of booby-trap casualties and sniper fire that had killed and maimed their friends without ever producing a visible enemy to shoot at. They entered a village in which they found no enemy soldiers, no weapons, no resistance, and they killed everyone they found anyway. The command structure that put them in that situation, with that preparation, in that environment, with those rules of engagement, and that had been systematically producing body count pressure throughout the preceding months, bore responsibility for what happened that the official accounting distributed only onto the men who pulled the triggers. Lieutenant William Calley was the only person convicted in connection with My Lai, and his conviction for the murder of 22 civilians was eventually commuted by President Nixon following a public response in which a substantial portion of the American population treated Calley as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The higher officers who bore command responsibility for the conditions that produced My Lai and for the concealment that followed it were investigated and in some cases charged, but no superior officer was convicted of any crime. General Samuel Costa, the American Division commander, was reduced in rank. Colonel Orrin Henderson was acquitted. The cover-up, which involved the deliberate falsification of reports at multiple levels and the active suppression of investigation, produced no criminal convictions among the officers who participated in it. The message this sent through the officer corps was not subtle. The relationship between the press and the military in Vietnam went through several distinct phases, and the management of information through each phase represented a sustained institutional effort to shape public understanding in ways that served the political requirements of continued war support. In the early years, reporters had relatively wide access to operations and produced a body of journalism that was often deeply skeptical of official claims. David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, and others reported from the field in ways that directly contradicted the official optimism being generated in Saigon, and their reporting generated intense hostility from the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, which pressured their news organizations and in some cases attempted to have them removed from the country. The hostility toward critical press coverage was not a response to inaccurate reporting. It was a response to accurate reporting. The reporters who were causing problems were causing them by getting the story right. By the later years of the war, the military's information management had become more sophisticated. Access was controlled more carefully. Briefings were structured to generate specific narratives. Statistics were presented in formats that made them difficult to contextualize or challenge in real time. The daily military briefings in Saigon, which the press corps called the 5 o'clock follies, became notorious for producing information that bore so little relationship to what reporters were observing in the field that they became a kind of dark comedy for the journalists who attended them. The briefers knew the information was unreliable. The journalists knew the information was unreliable. The briefings continued because they were not actually intended to inform the press. They were intended to create a paper record of official statements that could be pointed to as evidence that the public had been kept informed. The Pentagon Papers, the classified Defense Department history of American involvement in Vietnam that Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the press in 1971, revealed something that was in some ways more disturbing than any specific atrocity or specific lie. They revealed the degree to which the decision-making process at the highest levels had been conducted in explicit awareness of the gap between public statements and private assessments. Analysts and officials writing internally had assessed the chances of success in Vietnam in terms that ranged from cautious to deeply pessimistic, while the public face of the same government presented optimism and progress. The papers showed that decisions to escalate had been made, not because decision-makers believed escalation would win the war, but because they believed it would prevent an immediate loss, that the calculus was not victory, but delay, not success, but the avoidance of visible failure for long enough to make it someone else's problem. This is a specific kind of dishonesty that is more corrosive than simple lying, because it involves people who understand the situation, clearly making decisions designed to obscure that understanding from the people most affected by those decisions. The soldiers themselves knew things that the official version could not accommodate. They knew that the villages they were operating in were not enemy villages or friendly villages, but simply villages, inhabited by people whose relationship to the various forces moving through their lives was complex, contingent, and constantly recalculated based on whoever was physically present and what the consequences of different postures were. They knew that the Viet Cong infrastructure they were supposed to be dismantling was in many areas not a foreign imposition on a resistant population, but something that had grown from the population, had roots in it, and could not be extracted from it by military means without destroying the population itself. They knew that their Vietnamese allies, the ones they were supposed to be building into a capable fighting force, often did not share their objectives, did not trust them, and in some cases were actively working against them in ways that were nearly impossible to document or report. They knew that the war they were fighting did not resemble the war that was being described to the public, and many of them, upon returning home, found that there was no language available for what they had experienced that fit within the existing framework of American understanding of the conflict. The veterans who tried to speak about what they had seen and done faced a particular kind of institutional resistance. The Winter Soldier investigation in 1971, organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, produced hours of testimony from veterans describing war crimes, atrocities, and systematic violations of the laws of war. The military's response was to challenge the credentials and the credibility of the witnesses rather than to investigate the substance of their claims. Some of the witnesses could not prove they had served in the units and locations they described. Some accounts contained minor inaccuracies. The strategy was to use these vulnerabilities to dismiss the testimony entirely, to suggest that the Winter Soldier hearings were propaganda rather than evidence, and to avoid engaging with the overwhelming pattern of what was being described by treating each account as an isolated and unverified claim. The strategy worked, in the sense that it prevented the hearings from generating any official accountability. It did not work in the sense of making the testimony untrue. The intelligence failures of the war were not failures of collection, but failures of analysis, and more specifically failures of the willingness to let analysis produce conclusions that contradicted policy. The CIA's intelligence on North Vietnamese intentions and capabilities, on South Vietnamese political stability, on the effectiveness of the bombing campaigns, on the impact of escalation on enemy behavior, was often accurate and often contradicted the official optimism that the White House and the Pentagon were maintaining. The analysts who produced accurate pessimistic assessments found their work downgraded, sidelined, rewritten, or simply ignored. The process by which intelligence gets from analysts to decision-makers involves many points at which inconvenient conclusions can be softened, qualified, or removed. In Vietnam, that process was systematically biased toward producing assessments that would not disrupt existing policy. The people who ran it knew this. The intelligence community's internal history of the period is, in significant sections, a record of accurate analysis that was not allowed to influence decisions. The bombing campaigns of the war, particularly the campaign against North Vietnam, were evaluated in official reports in terms that bore little relationship to what the assessments of bombing effectiveness actually showed. The belief that sufficient air power applied to an adversary's industrial and logistical infrastructure would break its will to fight and its capacity to sustain combat was a fundamental article of faith in American air power doctrine, and it was wrong in the specific conditions of Vietnam in ways that the evidence demonstrated repeatedly and the official positions refused to acknowledge. North Vietnam had a limited industrial base, and what it had was dispersed, hardened, and supported by Soviet and Chinese supply that could replace what was destroyed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply network running through Laos and Cambodia, was bombed continuously and continuously repaired. Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign that ran from 1965 to 1968, consumed enormous resources, produced significant civilian casualties in North Vietnam, and did not achieve its stated objectives of reducing the enemy's ability to support operations in the South. This was known. Analyses within the system said so clearly. The bombing continued because stopping it would have been an acknowledgement of failure, and because the Air Force had institutional and budgetary stakes in demonstrating the effectiveness of strategic air power that was separate from the question of whether it was actually working. The use of technology in the Vietnam War produced its own specific forms of unreality. Sensors, reconnaissance, computer analysis, the electronic battlefield concept that Robert McNamara promoted as a substitute for ground troops, all of these generated data that was fed into systems and produced outputs that were used to direct operations. The data was often wrong. The sensors that were supposed to detect enemy movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail detected movement, but the intelligence analysts processing the data understood that they could not reliably distinguish enemy trucks from water buffalo, could not reliably distinguish enemy activity from the ordinary movements of a rural population, and could not reliably translate sensor data into actionable target information. This uncertainty was present in the technical assessments and was not present in the operational orders that the assessments generated. The strikes went in based on data that the people generating the data knew to be unreliable, and the damage assessments following the strikes used the same degraded data to evaluate what had been accomplished, which produced a loop in which unreliable inputs generated unreliable outputs that confirmed the value of the unreliable inputs. The morale of American forces went through a trajectory that is in many ways the psychological core of the war. In the early years, units were composed largely of professional soldiers and career NCOs alongside early draftees who had been caught up in the first waves of expansion, and the combination produced units with experience, discipline, and a degree of institutional cohesion. As the war expanded, as casualties mounted, as tours rotated, and the individual replacement system produced units in which a soldier might be the most experienced man in his squad after 3 months in country, the institutional knowledge and cohesion degraded. By the late 1960s, the rotation system, which cycled individual soldiers in and out of Vietnam on 12-month tours rather than rotating entire units, had produced a situation in which unit identity and trust were constantly being rebuilt from near zero, in which the veterans who provided continuity and experience were always either dead or about to rotate home, and in which the incentive structure for individual soldiers oriented toward personal survival and personal rotation date rather than unit mission and collective purpose. This is not a moral criticism of the soldiers. It is a description of a system designed to produce a specific kind of institutional fragmentation, and the system performed as designed. The short-timer psychology. The way that a soldier's orientation toward risk changed as his rotation date approached was well understood at the command level, and was not addressed structurally because addressing it would have required questioning the individual rotation system itself, which the military had adopted for reasons that had more to do with equity and political management at home than with operational effectiveness. Spreading the burden of Vietnam service across as large a portion of the eligible male population as possible, giving each man his year and bringing him home rather than leaving career soldiers deployed indefinitely, served political purposes. It produced a military in which, at any given moment, the people most at risk of dying were also the people most determined not to, and the people most experienced in the specific conditions of a particular area were also the people most likely to be leaving it. The GI resistance movement that developed within the military by the early 1970s was another thing that official accounts of the period were slow to acknowledge, and that has remained relatively marginal in popular memory of the war. Soldiers organized, they published underground newspapers, they refused orders, they demanded lawyers before assignments, they wore peace symbols on their uniforms, they gave the Black Power salute and marked their helmets with anti-war slogans. In some rear echelon areas, there were informal combat refusals, situations in which units or elements of units declined to enter areas they considered too dangerous, or operations they considered pointless, and in which the command structure, aware that forcing the issue might produce either fragging or a more visible confrontation, declined to force it. The war by 1970 and 1971 was in some areas being fought by a military that was in quiet internal rebellion against the conditions it was being asked to endure, and the management of that rebellion consumed command attention and institutional resources that were, on paper, being applied to fighting the enemy. The draft and its inequities were known and not discussed honestly in official contexts. The mechanisms by which the children of the well-connected, the well-educated and the white avoided military service while the poor, the undereducated and disproportionately black and Hispanic men served and died were not secret. They were embedded in the structure of the draft system. College deferments, occupational deferments, National Guard slots that were distributed through connections rather than need, medical exemptions that responded to private physician letters in ways they did not respond to the medical conditions of men who could not afford private physicians. The people who designed and administered the draft knew these inequities were present. The people who benefited from them used them without public comment. The people who were unable to use them went to Vietnam and came back changed or did not come back. And the contrast between their experience and the experience of the generation's most visible figures, who found other arrangements, was a fact that shaped the political and social landscape of the war years and was discussed everywhere except in official contexts. The treatment of black soldiers in Vietnam and their experience of the war's specific contradictions is a chapter that official memory has consistently compressed. African American soldiers served in disproportionate numbers in frontline combat units in the early years of the war, a pattern that reflected both the mechanics of the draft and the military occupational specialty assignment processes that channeled men with lower test scores or fewer educational credentials into infantry rather than technical specialties. They were dying at rates that were visible enough to generate political commentary and enough pressure that the military made deliberate adjustments to assignment patterns to reduce the statistical disparity. They were also fighting a war in behalf of a country that, during the exact years of their service, was conducting its own internal conflict over whether they were entitled to the basic rights of citizenship. The specific surrealism of being in a village in the Mekong Delta fighting communism in 1967, while cities in the United States were burning over civil rights, was not lost on the men who were doing it. The racial tensions within American units in Vietnam, the segregated fraternization patterns, the racial violence that occurred in rear areas and sometimes in the field, were documented in military surveys and addressed in command communications, and were not part of the public narrative of the war. The fall of Saigon in April 1975, the helicopters lifting from the embassy roof, the crowds at the gates, the chaotic end of the American commitment, was presented in official retrospect as a surprising and unfortunate conclusion to a long effort, rather than as the predictable outcome of a process that internal assessments had been projecting for years. People within the intelligence community and the State Department had been documenting the likelihood of South Vietnamese collapse in the absence of American support throughout the early 1970s. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 were understood by many of the people who negotiated them to be a framework for American withdrawal, rather than a genuine settlement, because the political and military conditions that made South Vietnamese independence sustainable had not been created. The accords were sold to the American public as peace with honor, a formulation that required accepting that the terms being agreed to would produce an outcome that could be described as honorable rather than as what it was, which was a managed retreat from a position that could not be held at a cost that the political system would continue to bear. The institutional memory of the war, the way it has been processed and incorporated into American military thinking, has its own patterns of omission. The lesson that the military drew from Vietnam, expressed in doctrine and in the reforms of the 1970s and 1980s, focused heavily on technical and organizational improvements, on better training, better equipment, better interoperability between services, better command and control. The Powell Doctrine and the Weinberger Doctrine articulated conditions under which military force should be used that were explicitly designed to prevent another Vietnam, another protracted commitment without clear objectives and measurable success criteria. What these lessons did not address, or addressed only obliquely, was the problem of institutional dishonesty in reporting, the systematic bias toward optimism that the reporting chain had produced, the way that career incentives generated false intelligence, the way that political pressure distorted operational assessment. The technical lessons were absorbed. The institutional honesty lessons were much harder to teach because teaching them required acknowledging what had actually gone wrong. And what had actually gone wrong was not primarily a technical failure. There were men who tried to report accurately. There were intelligence officers who filed assessments that contradicted the official line and took career consequences for doing it. There were journalists who wrote stories that were accurate and were excluded from official access in retaliation. There were soldiers who refused specific orders they considered criminal and were court-martialed for it. And some of them were vindicated eventually in ways that came too late to matter for the time they served. The resistance to the institutional dishonesty was real, dispersed, often isolated, and consistently outmatched by the institutional momentum it was resisting. The people who tried to tell the truth were not heroes in any way that the system recognized. They were problems to be managed, and managing them was something the system was quite good at. The veterans who came home found themselves in a country that did not know how to talk about what they had done. The anti-war movement's hostility toward the military had produced a social climate in which returning veterans sometimes encountered contempt or indifference rather than the reception that service, whatever one thought of the war's purposes, deserved. The military institution they had served was in the process of conducting its own accounting, focused on restoration and reform, not particularly interested in honest examination of what had happened. The Department of Veterans Affairs was underfunded and unprepared for the psychological aftermath of a war that had eroded, in many men, the basic capacity to integrate their experience into a coherent narrative because the experience itself had been so systematically resistant to coherence. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, more than 5 years after the fall of Saigon, and the resistance to recognizing it had institutional dimensions that went beyond scientific uncertainty. Recognizing it fully would have required acknowledging the scale of psychological damage the war had produced, which would have required engaging honestly with what had produced it, which was not something the institutions involved were prepared to do. The specific texture of what soldiers carried home was not uniform. Some men carried guilt about things they had done or had not done to prevent. Some carried grief for friends in ways that had nowhere to go because the country's grief process was not organized around this particular loss. Some carried a kind of pervasive unreality, a difficulty connecting with a civilian world that had no reference points for what they had been in. Some carried anger at the war, at the command structures, at the political processes, at the country that had sent them, and then declined to engage seriously with what it had sent them into. The VA system, the community mental health infrastructure, the social networks that might have absorbed and supported them were not equal to the scope and character of what they were being asked to absorb. Men fell through every gap in that system, and fell for years. And the official accounting of the war's costs continued to focus on the numbers that had been reported during the conflict, rather than on the numbers that were accumulating afterward. The chemical exposures, as mentioned, continued to produce consequences for decades. The VA's recognition of Agent Orange-related conditions expanded slowly and contentiously, each new condition added to the presumptive list after years of advocacy, documentation, and legal action by veterans organizations and individual veterans who had to fight for recognition of damage that the government's own contractors had helped create. The Vietnamese population, both soldiers and civilians, who had been exposed to the defoliant program at higher concentrations over longer periods, had no comparable advocacy infrastructure and no legal recourse in American courts, and the question of what the United States owed to that population was never seriously engaged by the political system that had authorized the program. The history of American involvement in Laos during the Vietnam War era is substantially more obscured than the history of the main conflict. The CIA's operation in Laos, which ran throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, constituted a secret war conducted on a significant scale using CIA officers, contract pilots, and the Hmong population organized and armed by the agency into a substantial fighting force under General Vung Pao. The scale of the operation was hidden from Congress and from the public by classification, by the use of proprietary CIA airlines and contract employees rather than uniformed military, and by a systematic policy of denial that extended to congressional testimony. Senators who were briefed on parts of the program understood that they were not being told everything, and that the institutional rules of the briefing system did not easily permit aggressive follow-up questioning. The Hmong fighters and their families, who committed themselves to the American war effort in Laos on the basis of commitments made by CIA officers in the field, found that those commitments did not survive the end of American engagement. The abandonment of the Hmong, who faced severe persecution from the Pathet Lao following American withdrawal, was an outcome that the people who had organized the operation had assessed as likely and had not incorporated into their planning in any serious way. The unexploded ordnance that remains in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia from the bombing campaigns of the war era continues to kill and injure people decades after the last American soldier left the region. Laos is the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, a designation that reflects the scale of the interdiction campaign against the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through Laotian territory for years and that left large areas of the country seeded with cluster munitions, many of them designed to not explode on initial impact and to function as persistent area denial weapons, which means that they continued to function as designed long after any military purpose for them had dissolved. The people who are still dying from this ordnance are not casualties of a war. They are casualties of a policy, and the policy was made by specific people who knew what they were deploying, and the accountability for what those weapons continue to do has never been seriously engaged. The gap between the war that is remembered and the war that happened is not a gap that formed accidentally. It was produced by specific decisions made by specific people to emphasize certain facts and suppress others, to prosecute certain individuals and protect others, to fund certain programs and defund others, to classify certain documents and release others. The official memory of the war that has congealed in American culture over the decades since is a negotiated artifact, shaped by what the military and political institutions involved found it comfortable to acknowledge, by what veterans organizations found it useful to emphasize, by what the entertainment industry found it commercially viable to portray, and by what the broader culture found it psychologically manageable to absorb. It is not a lie in the simple sense. It contains true things. But it is not an honest accounting of what happened, because an honest accounting would require engaging with the systemic nature of the dishonesty that ran through the war from near its beginning. And that engagement has not happened in any serious institutional form. The specific things that were ordered to be kept quiet, the body count manipulation, the civilian casualties, the fragging, the drug use, the true state of ARVN capacity, the Phoenix program's actual methods, the secret bombing, the intelligence suppression, the racial violence, the GI resistance, the environmental damage, the abandonment of allies, none of these are secret in the sense that they are unavailable to anyone who wants to look. They are documented in archives, in memoirs, in journalism, in academic history. They are not hidden. They are simply not central to the way the war is remembered, not integrated into the standard account, not reflected in the official monuments and official commemorations. The wall in Washington lists the names of the Americans who died. It does not list the circumstances under which they died, the decisions that put them in those circumstances, or what was known about those decisions by the people who made them. The war continued after the peace agreements. It continued in the minds of the men who had fought it. It continued in the bodies of the Vietnamese, who were still dying from its physical residue. It continued in the political and institutional cultures that had generated it and that absorbed its lessons selectively, and continued in subsequent conflicts to reproduce some of the same patterns of optimistic official reporting, body count metrics, suppressed dissent, and the systematic management of domestic perception that the Vietnam War had made visible. The specific techniques evolved. The essential dynamic did not. And the silence that had sustained the war, the silence of the officer who did not correct the report, the silence of the official who did not challenge the estimate, the silence of the politician who did not ask the question whose answer he did not want to hear. That silence settled into the institutional structure and remained there, unremarkable, functional, and ongoing, long after the helicopters had lifted from the embassy roof and the last American had left the country that the war had been fought in and over and through without ever quite being about.